Welcome, everyone. Good evening. Thank you all for being here. My name is Andy Cooper-Smith. I'm the managing director of the Wharton Public Policy Initiative. When I tell people that I work for Wharton Public Policy, I'm often greeted with kind of a surprised look. Wharton does public policy? Why would a business school have a particular interest in public policy? My office, the Wharton Public Policy Initiative, was started about 6 years ago in recognition of the fact that public policy really affects everything, including the business world. And Wharton began to realize that if it wants to prepare the next generation of leaders, it's not enough to train them in economics and finance and management. Public policy needs to be part of the mix too. And that's where my office comes in, to support opportunities for students to engage in public policy and wrestle with many of the critical questions that face us all as a society. And we do that through speaker events, through internships and research positions, and also through very special opportunities like this. And so when we were approached by AEI to help host this summit, we were really delighted to do so. So on behalf of Wharton, I really want to welcome you here. Looking forward to the next 24 hours or so, a very great engagement of ideas among a variety of topics. And I'm going to turn things over now to David Jimenez from AEI to start our first session. So thank you all.
Thank you all for joining us. We're so grateful you came all over from the Midwest, New England, Mid-Atlantic South to join us here over the next day as we think about some of the most pressing challenges facing both the United States and the wider world. I want to give a few just thank yous at the moment for one, John and Andy, just their fantastic team, along with the catering and AV team here putting together this amazing program for us in this incredibly beautiful space. So thanks again for that. I also want to give a round of thanks to the members of the John Jay Institute who are joining us. They are fellows here studying great texts right near Philadelphia for a semester. So definitely chat with them to hear about their postgraduate experience as you think about your own plans after graduation. And also for the many University of Pennsylvania students who are not affiliated with the Executive Council program who joined us. So to get started, to begin, obviously we've seen over the past couple of years a lot of policy ideas from the Green New Deal and a $15 minimum wage to a radical conservative revisiting of policies on immigration and trade have shown that what we thought was possible in public policy has now been widened considerably. Some people think that these ideas are no more than an expression of demagoguery and reckless populism. Others think they are a necessary way to kind of widen and challenge a broken consensus that existed in Washington. And others think the truth might lie somewhere in the middle. And to help us think about those questions about where conservative and progressive domestic economic policy thinking should go, I think we're joined with two incredibly thoughtful, serious public intellectuals who will help us wrestle with this question tonight. The first to my immediate right is Ramesh Ponnuru. He's a colleague of mine at the American Enterprise Institute. He's a visiting fellow at AEI where he studies the future of conservatism with a particular focus on healthcare, economic policy, and constitutionalism. He is also a senior editor for National Review, a columnist for Bloomberg View, and a contributor to CBS News. A prolific writer, he is the author of The Party of Death and the Mystery of Japanese Growth. A frequent contributor to television and radio, Mr. Ponnuru has appeared on Face the Nation, CBS, Meet the Press, MSNBC, The Week, ABC News, and PBS. He holds a BA in history from Princeton University. Jared Bernstein, to my far right, joined the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities in 2011 as a senior fellow. From 2009 to 2011, he was the chief economist and economic advisor for Vice President Joe Biden, and executive director of the White House Task Force on the Middle Class, and a member of President Barack Obama's economic team. Before joining the Obama administration, he was a senior economist for the Economic Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. Between 1995 and 1996, he held the position of deputy chief economist at the U.S. Department of Labor. He's the author and co-author of numerous books for both popular and academic audiences, including A Reconstruction Agenda, Crunch, Why Do I Feel So Squeezed, and Other Unsolved Economic Mysteries, and 9 editions of The State of Working America. He has published extensively in various venues, and he holds a doctorate in social welfare from Columbia University. Jared and Ramesh, thank you so much for joining us tonight. So before turning to some of the questions that I prepared that I'm sure the perceptive questions our audience will ask later, I'd like for maybe each of you to start and maybe talk for 5 minutes about where you see the respective state and potential future of either conservative domestic policy thinking, in your case, Ramesh, and progressive policy thinking on your side, Jared. So Ramesh, care to start for us?
I get the short straw. All right. So I think that conservative domestic policy thinking is in a state of dormancy right now. For many years, conservatives in the U.S. coasted on a program that had been designed in the late 1970s and had been successful. I think successful in policy terms, certainly successful politically. But a program that had reached diminishing returns, partly because of its success. You can cut a 70% top tax rate a lot, but once you've already got it down to 35%, you can't keep cutting it quite as substantially. Of course, if things are going the way some of our left-wing friends want them to, we'll be back at 70% and we'll be able to do it again. I think President Trump became the Republican nominee in important part, because the old Republican program, the old conservative program, had gotten stale and out of date and no longer spoke to the concerns of people, including even Republican voters. But Trump has not, I think, replaced the old program with something new, something that sort of fleshes out the impulses that he has or that with which he connected to his constituency. That kind of thing, agenda development, doesn't seem to be among his political talents. So the Republicans took power in 2017. They had unified control of the government, and yet they didn't really know what they stood for. They were sort of intellectually speaking in the wilderness, the way parties often are when they're out of power, trying to figure out what they should believe in and how they're going to get power back, but in this odd situation of actually controlling everything. And I think that the sort of sputtering results of Republican governance in 2017 and 2018 partly reflect that. Now, I think that there is some ferment happening, not primarily among politicians, but you do have a lot of conservative intellectuals who are writing interesting things about trade or about what to do about working class wages, or whether there's a distinctive conservative approach to paid leave for new parents. But I think that right now that's mostly sort of under the surface. What it has going for it is the explosion of that old orthodoxy. So there's no longer as strong a sense of, well, you can't cross this red line here or that red line there because Republican voters will never go for it. I think there's now a much more of an understanding of the actual political ground, and that a lot of voters are not particularly wedded to a conservative orthodoxy that lasted from 80 to now. And I think what that creates the room for, ideally, would be the ability to apply characteristically conservative insights about when and why markets work, about decentralization and federalism to the problems of our day, with an understanding that the problems of our day are not the same problems that existed in 1980. But I think that work is still in pretty early stages.
I think the current state of affairs, as per David's question, is characterized by three dynamics: a failure, a problem, and a vulnerability. The failure, which I think Ramesh was just getting to, and by the way, I should start by saying it's a pleasure to be here, especially with Ramesh and David and all of you. I've already had 10 great conversations. I already feel a little bit more confident about the future having talked to the folks here today. So there's just a lot of really great, energetic, young brain power in here. And I'm looking forward to our discussion. So a failure, a problem, and a vulnerability. The failure, as Ramesh was just, I think, getting at, is at least the way I would frame it, as a failure of the neoliberal model to realize its promises. This is a model that broadly argued if we leave markets generally alone, and if we promote globalization and immigration, the free movements of people and capital and ideas, and with a government sector that kind of nibbles around the edges at market failure. So there, under the neoliberal system, certainly a social insurance system is acceptable, but a $15 minimum wage an hour and a big tax on wealth may not be. This system, this system actually, I think, in many ways is perceiving as have failed to deliver the goods. And that takes me to the second dynamic, which is the problem. That neoliberal idea, markets leavened with globalization and immigration, with a little bit of government on the side, failed to deliver in terms of macroeconomic growth, which has been subpar for the last decade and a half. Inequality, which is really quite soaring, particularly in our economy, but more also in Europe and to some extent even in China. Climate. Essentially, the neoliberal model has failed to suitably answer the questions that so many of the electorate are bringing to it. Where's the economic growth? What about the inequality? Why are me and my community left behind in terms of wage stagnation? And so that's the failure of the promise, the problem that failure generates, and the vulnerability that it creates. The failure of the system and the problem it creates has left us vulnerable to people who can come to the electorate and say, I've got the solution. First of all, let's blame it on people who don't look like us, blame it on the Mexicans, blame it on minorities, blame it on whomever. So this is strongman populism. Blame it on the elites, people like me and Ramesh. Blame it on the elites, blame it on the Mexicans, blame it on whomever. So this is a false target, but this is one that is unfortunately in play when that vulnerability is created. What's exciting about the current moment, and I'll wind up here with my initial comments, is that the falsehood of that promise is becoming evident at the same time. A pretty exciting, from my perspective, group of progressive Democrats is offering a different solution. Now, anytime you're into, I've got the answer and it's this, you are at risk. But as someone who's been in the policy world for decades, there are solutions being proposed, and I will get to them, that strike me as having a better chance to meet the true vulnerabilities that the problem of the failure of the neoclassical promises has delivered to us.
So, Jared, turning to the question of young, eager progressive Democrats, the rise of groups like Democratic Socialists for America, exploding subscriptions to magazines like Jacobin and M+1, and some of the new freshman voices you mentioned, seems to suggest that socialism is no longer an insult in American politics, but a rallying cry. Some on the left, I'm thinking people at, say, Third Way or Progressive Policy Institute, would say that these voices are no more than kind of a Trumpism, quote unquote, or Tea Party of the left. Conversely, other left liberals, perhaps like yourself or Jonathan Chait, would appreciate these new socialist voices for, widening the range of possibilities and getting us out of the, perceived technocratic, overly cautious third way liberalism of Obama and Clinton. How do you judge the impact of greater interest in socialism on democratic thinking?
Well, I think I probably would be wary to go too far down this socialist kind of explanation. I mean, it's true that there are some people in Congress who call themselves Democrat socialists, but we actually have a much more diverse Congress than we've ever had before. I think we're in no danger, as Trump said in the State of the Union, of becoming a socialist economy. And in fact, every single market economy that exists has elements of capitalism and socialism very much embedded in them. So it's a matter of where you put, and your question got at this, David, it's a matter of where you place yourself on the continuum. I guess relating to my first set of comments and the failure of political platforms thus far to meet the kinds of challenges that we faced, I like the fact that the window is being open and that there's real aspirations to do things that I think will address them. And here I think you have to do what Ramesh was doing and get down in the weeds and say, well, what this is a matter of cases. What are we talking about? So sure, I actually believe that we could make healthcare a lot more affordable. I think that we could collect a great deal more revenue than we're collecting now. And in fact, I'll give you some numbers later if we want to get into the weeds. We're collecting far less revenue as a share of GDP than we should be, given how solid the economy is, and that has to do with the tax cut. So I think that we could amply raise enough revenue through progressive sources and use it to implement solutions to the kinds of problems I was taking you through, inequality, wage stagnation, climate, that have a much better chance of working than the kinds of policies that were served up either by the cramped box that you mentioned, which I was a member of, I was in that cramped box, or the Trump regime.
So, Ramesh, turning to hip anti-capitalist, post-capitalist thought right now, there was a monologue by Tucker Carlson a few weeks ago that inspired columns from you, Senator Mike Lee, and Ben Shapiro, among others. And that monologue seemed to clarify a real division in the right, but on a discussion of possible tensions between a general preference for libertarianism or kind of market-oriented solutions, and the fear that those kind of policies might be undermining traditional conservative commitments to strong, cohesive families, rooted communities, and civil society. Do you think it's time for the American right, perhaps like the right or center-right in other parts of the Western world, to reevaluate or at least temper its historic commitment to free market capitalism?
So Tucker's argument, well, one of his many arguments, was that the market is a tool. It is not something to be worshipped. And I think that's half right. Market is not something to be worshipped, but it's not just a tool. Economic liberty is an aspect of human flourishing that is valuable in its own right. That doesn't mean that it can never be justly limited. And sensible, thoughtful conservatives have never believed otherwise, nor is the Republican Party committed to, or has it ever been committed to, an extreme version of laissez-faire. So I think that it is useful to be reminded that we're not here to serve abstractions, but to figure out how to promote the common good. And that may sometimes involve limiting the market or shaping the market in a different way. Sometimes it may involve liberating the market. And I think Tucker gives short shrift to that. I think, for example, that it would be enormously worthwhile to build a bipartisan coalition that it is possible to build in our country, for example, for liberalizing occupational licensure rules, where we shouldn't, a third of all the jobs in the country should not require government permission before you can enter them.
Or zoning.
Residential zoning is another place where I think that you've shrunk a lot of opportunities. But look, I mean, philosophically, if you boil it down to the idea that market freedom should not be unlimited, that there are social problems that we need to address, all of that I think makes a lot of sense. I think it comes wrapped in Tucker's case, a lot of nonsense, and in particular, a lot of anti-elitist nonsense. I think there have been enormous elite failures in our country. But the idea, for example, Tucker made a big deal out of this, that marijuana legalization is something that is being pushed on unwilling Americans by a dastardly elite personified by, of all people, Mitt Romney, is completely disconnected from reality. In fact,
He's a huge pothead.
More American.
Nice to buy from him.
Look,
that's a joke.
As between Mitt Romney and Tucker Carlson, I have some suspicions about who has smoked more pot over the years. But look, I mean, that's something that it's just, that is, I think, something that can be politically powerful because people like blaming shadowy, powerful others. But I think it is a total intellectual and moral cul-de-sac.
So, Jared, turning to the language right now, the Green New Deal, I don't think can't just be limited to that policy. It seems like there's a strong argument on the left that a lot of their ambitious policies are not coming from a vacuum, but are really just a recreation, to some extent, of kind of the New Deal, Keynesian order, the 30 glorious years, as some would say in French, between the 40s and 60s, where we seem to have more state interventions and had pretty high rates of wage and employment growth. Some center-left people and conservatives would say that this is ultimately an exercise in nostalgia, and it doesn't take seriously why that regime ultimately fell apart in the 1970s. Do you think the New Deal era and the post-war consensus, so to speak, in much of the Western world can actually inform the policies we choose today?
I think that we should aspire to achieve the kinds of unemployment rates, low unemployment rates, and perhaps growth rates, and certainly the distribution of growth that prevailed in those years. I see no reason not to aspire to that. I think the important insight that links up to your question from kind of the golden age of growth, which, by the way, was also an age of very intense discrimination, which is far from over. But in terms of per capita income growth now, sort of flitting around 2%. Back there it was 3.5%, 4%. There's just a lot more you can do when you have growth rates of that magnitude. And the distribution was such that every single income quintile doubled from the late 40s to the mid 70s. And in fact, the growth was faster at the bottom than it was at the top. That was the period when inequality was really declining. And those are all important aspirations. And to bring it down, and I do think, and again, I think Ramesh is always very good at forcing us to do this, bringing it down to a level of actual concrete policy, so we're not just up in the sky. One of the things that means in the current context is that there's going to need to be a kind of almost a Keynesian function that helps the government, that helps the economy achieve full employment, even when we're in an expansion which is in year 9 or 10 already. So I may hate the Trump tax cuts more than anybody, but it is a pretty interesting experiment in stimulating an economy that's already closing in on full employment. And what happened? We didn't have inflation take off. We had unemployment go down to 50-year lows. That tells you something. Some economists call it secular stagnation. That's just sort of a fancy way of saying that left to its own devices, economies are not getting to full employment, and not just here. This is a broader problem, and it's kind of what I was alluding to in my introductory comments. So I do think one lesson we can take from those years is that it will take an amply funded, strong, and pretty interventionist government to help achieve the level of full employment that I'm talking about, so that full employment doesn't mean 4% overall, but 10 or 12 for African Americans. It means everybody's at full employment.
So Ramesh, I think this ties into your opening remarks and to our discussion just now of kind of the history of political economy. You and other reform conservative intellectuals criticize a perceived entrapment of conservative thinking in the problems and the challenges and the successes of the Reagan era. How do you actually, perhaps specifically, see this nostalgia at work in impoverishing the quality of center-right discourse?
Well, I mentioned one which was the obsession on the top income tax rate, as though it mattered as much. It matters as much as it did in 1980, when the income tax was the main tax most people paid, which is not the case anymore. The payroll tax is a bigger burden for more people than the income taxes. When people were being kicked into higher brackets because of high inflation, that ended. Reagan ended that, indexed the brackets for inflation, and also started the process. The process started around that time of bringing inflation down. So just circumstances change. I think his solutions made a lot of sense for those circumstances that he faced. Inflation being another. During the we've gone through about 10 years now when the inflation rate has been below the Federal Reserve's 2% annual target. And yet, if you listen to a lot of my conservative friends, including our former colleague Kevin Hassett, now at the Council of Economic Advisors, you would have thought during Obama's first term that we were about to fall into Zimbabwe or Venezuela-style hyperinflation, right? There is, I think, a lot of kind of fighting yesterday's battle, but I think that's a very common thing that happens to groups and movements that are successful. They get trapped in trying to relive that success. The thing I always remind people is that the famous quote from Reagan's first inaugural address, everybody quotes this, government is not the solution, government is the problem. The actual quote was, in this present crisis, government is not the solution, government is the problem. The idea wasn't that government was always and everywhere the problem, let alone that government was always and everywhere the same way the problem, and that you have to think anew.
Jared, so when the histories are written of the Obama administration, I'm sure historians will definitely look at your internal heated arguments with other officials about issues related to fiscal austerity and entitlement reform, where you really did criticize this increasing bipartisan consensus on the need for substantial budget cuts. Today, your views seem to be gaining more traction, reflected above all in a piece by Jason Furman and Larry Summers in Foreign Affairs, basically saying that maybe this past anxiety about the debt was overplaced. So why do you continue to find that anxiety misplaced? And do you think concerns about fiscal sustainability should in any way temper new progressive ambitions for new programs?
Yeah, I'll answer that. Let me just say I want to just hitchhike for a second on Ramesh's points. Yeah, I think somebody recently said that the inflation rate in Venezuela is something like 1,000,000%, and so ours is 2%. So yeah, that kind of socialist threat doesn't quite resonate with me. I think I have this very weird counter-cyclical kind of view of fiscal policy. When everybody's worried about the budget deficit, I'm not worried about it. And then when everybody decides it doesn't matter anymore, I start to get worried about it. I think that the way to think about this, and I think we have a country, we in this country have gotten it quite wrong, although not as wrong as Europe, which has really caused very serious human suffering based on these wrong-headed austerity notions, which, by the way, just to be clear, the terminology, this means fiscal contraction when the economy still needs government support. And as I was arguing in my last set of comments, I think that kind of support is much more commonly needed now than is widely recognized because of some of the inherent factors, we can get into them, that are leading to slower growth. And so I think when you're in a particularly weak economy like a Great Recession, when I was in the White House, the very first quarter that we were in the White House, so this is 2009 Q1, and I was one of those people that had to go out and talk to the TV cameras about it. We'd get a jobs report and it'd be like, we just lost 700,000 jobs. Jared, go talk to the country about this. I remember David Axelrod putting his arm around me once and saying, get out there, anybody can sell good news.
That's why his hair is white.
Yeah. But anyway, that's when your question should be not, is our deficit too large? Should we pivot to deficit reduction, which we kind of did too early? It should be, is your deficit large enough to offset the demand contraction? And it wasn't. And again, Europe was even worse. Now, we're at the flip side. So now we're an economy that's closing in on full employment. We can argue about how close we are. I actually think our deficit and debt should be coming down for a bunch of reasons, for no small part because we want to sort of be fiscally loaded for when the next recession hits. So I would distance myself from some, often come under the rubric of the MMT crowd that kind of argues, well, you can just keep stimulating the economy until inflation breaks out, and then you can do something and stop that. I don't. It's a lot harder than that. That sounds to me like a recipe for a hard landing. So I very much appreciate the MMT sorts of input and the anti-austerians. This country has long suffered from deficit attention disorder, and that's something that I've tried to argue against, as you've suggested. But it can mess you up if you push it too far.
Ramesh, in 2012, one could argue that Paul Ryan was, selected to be the vice presidential nominee precisely for what was perceived as his, leadership and courage on the issue of entitlement reform. In the 2016 primary, it seems like Trump actually gained success and perhaps won the general election by distancing himself from the conservative views on how to restructure Medicare and Social Security. Do you think conservatives need to hold on to those commitments and just figure out a new way to communicate those commitments to its new lower middle class, working class base? Or do you think entitlement reform was perhaps too emphasized by your colleagues, either on the Hill or in think tank space on the right?
So I think entitlement reform is important. I think that we need to get Medicare, Social Security, and Medicaid's projected spending commitments in line with revenues over the long run. That does not have to take the form and shouldn't take the form of immediate year-on-year cuts, but I think should take the form of long-run restraint in the growth of spending on those programs. And I think you can do that in a variety of intelligent ways. I think the mistake of the 2012 era Republicans was that there wasn't an offer of positive goods that a lot of people were going to get, especially lower middle class people. The economic agenda really was sort of all kind of eat your spinach, and that is not tend to be a successful program. And Mitt Romney, he sort of made a kind of philosophical principle out of this. If you remember, after the election, and we talked, Romney and I talked a little bit about this off the record after the election. He talked about how he hadn't given gifts, hadn't offered gifts to voters. He had just talked about the national interest, and he was, when he got 47% of the vote, it seems like maybe he should have offered gifts to just 4% of the voters. Would have been a little bit better. But look, there's something actually odd. It wasn't just Mitt. It was an entire strain of conservative thinking that kind of divorced itself in a very odd way for a conservative party from voters' self-interest. And, we think about self-interest and how self-interest can align with the common interest in all kinds of other contexts. Why don't we think about it in terms of the political context? So in a way, what I wanted in 2012, and what I was arguing for in various places, was you keep entitlement reform, maybe modify it in some ways, but you add to it a suite of other policies that are designed to help people, for example, who are having trouble with our existing higher education system, for whom health insurance is hard to acquire or keep. And what instead the party did through Trump was dump entitlement reform and not adopt any new policies. The kind of thing I was talking about and some like-minded people were talking about, I think, was a pitch that was designed in part to help attract people who are more, again, lower middle class and younger, starting out in life, starting families. Whereas I think the Trump appeal, which is no threat to entitlements and nothing new for people who are starting out in life, is better designed to appeal to older folks. I don't like it, but in a certain sense, I think you'd have to say politically it has worked, at least in the short run.
Let me respond to that a little bit. I really appreciated a lot of what Ramesh was saying back then and his like-minded buddies. But I think I'm pretty squishy on this idea of Social Security and Medicare reform. And I think it ties into some of my earlier comments about what I consider a pretty exciting agenda that's opening the Overton window a bit right now. If you look at what it would take to, so when people say reform, and Ramesh made this clear, but I just want to make sure everybody hears it. When people say reform, they're talking about cutting benefits relative to what's currently promised, slowing the growth rate. And that sometimes reform sounds better than putting it that way. But so you have to ask yourself, is that good policy? Well, I actually think one of the best things the government does right now, even in its dysfunctional state, is provide for retirement security, for income security, and healthcare security. And those programs are beloved, Social Security and Medicare. They're also extremely efficient, very low overhead. And Medicare prices, I know there are a lot of healthcare economist types in the room. I talked to some of them. Medicare, the growth rate of Medicare prices has long been below that of those in the private sector. And in fact, they're related. As Medicare prices have come down, as the growth of prices in Medicare have come down, it's bled into the private sector. These are tremendous success stories. Moreover, they're not the world's most generous program. The average Social Security benefit, I think, for a year is like $17,000. Now, what I worry is that if you try to reform Social Security and Medicare, you might break Social Security and Medicare. Because in order to make them actuarially solvent, you'd have to cut too deeply into that success story. Now, I have no compunction against cutting Social Security benefits for people like me and, Bill Gates. I'm not like Bill Gates. But I'm just saying, if you want to talk about cutting Social Security for rich people, go right ahead. But that only solves a tiny little slice of the problem. To actually get down to to solve Social Security through cuts, you'd have to, and Medicare, I think you'd have to break it. So what I hear, and this just tying it into the current kind of current events, what I hear a lot of the younger members and even some of the older members who are jumping through the wider Overton window is the idea that we just have to raise more revenues to support these programs. Now, we used to talk about a grand bargain. We'll raise revenues and cut benefits. And maybe there's something there. And again, if it means cutting benefits for those who won't miss them, I have no problem with that. But there's no solution to any problem we face that doesn't involve collecting more revenue. I am sure that's true. And I'm happy to defend that if anybody wants to debate it with me.
Ramesh, do you want to respond at all?
Yes, the first affirmative
reform. Yeah.
So on Social Security in particular, Social Security is a very popular program. I think it's a program that combines two elements that are conceptually distinct, which is an income transfer program to protect people from destitution in old age, and a kind of forced savings program. And it's not especially great, though, at either one of those things. I think that we could augment the program at the bottom end so that we actually abolished elderly poverty for a lot less money than Social Security spends and is projected to spend if we said that, for example, if you're a median worker making middle of the spectrum income through life, you will get the same benefit in inflation-adjusted terms if you retire in 2040 that the middle-income person who's retiring today is getting, but you don't get more than that. And similarly for higher earners.
You should explain how that's different than current law.
Whereas the current law is that it rises with wages. So the retiree of 2040, if there's been any real economic growth and any wage growth between now and then, that median employee is going to get a bigger benefit, even with inflation adjustment, than today's retiree gets. So the question for me is it worth raising the middle income person's taxes in order to give that same person a higher benefit when he retires? And this is, I think, a conservative versus liberal kind of philosophical split. There is a certain gain in security from doing that. But I think it makes more sense to take care of those who most need the help and tell people who can save that they should save for themselves rather than expecting a government benefit that is going to rise every year automatically with no regard for the overall federal budget. Again, I think similar principles. It's a much more complicated story, but I think similar principles can be applied to Medicare. I wouldn't say that I'm dead set against tax increases, especially the right kind of tax increases. But my strong preference would be to reduce the amount of middle class and especially upper middle class welfare that the federal government's engaged in.
So the problem, a couple of problems with that from my perspective. First of all, Social Security is a program that's built around this notion of intergenerational solidarity. So I grow up, I contribute to a system, can hopefully contribute to the economy's productivity, and I leave my progeny, my kids and your kids, well, you are kids, but my kids and your parents' kids, with a more productive economy. And their retirement living standards can rise with the productivity of that economy thanks to the construction of Social Security. I think it's actually a very eloquent way for an intergenerational contract to exist in perpetuity. And I certainly don't want to change it into just a poverty program. And in fact, one of the things, again, I like, and here's this may be another difference. One of the things I like about some of the new ideas I'm hearing, there's something called the GAIN Act from Sherrod Brown and Ro Khanna. There's something called the LIFT Act from Kamala Harris, is an idea that because middle-class families have suffered so much wage stagnation over the last 3 or 4 decades, we actually have to tailor policies to help them more than we have in the past. So here's a number from the Federal Reserve. 40% of families couldn't come up with an emergency $400 that they need, for some emergency, without borrowing it or selling something. So the idea that you could sort of hope that middle-class families just save more in the context of this middle-income stagnation problem just seems to me to be, pretty problematic. One other factoid I'll leave you with. So solvency for Social Security and Medicare, it may sound like it's like this really impossible thing. It's 1 percentage point of GDP for each one over the next 10 years. Now, you can go out further than that and create all kinds of scary stories. And it's not that I don't believe those stories, but I think once you're getting past the 10-year budget projection, you're really into some science fiction. So I don't think 1% of GDP in both those programs is actually shouldn't be that heavy of a lift.
So you'll be fine with that 1% cut. I would just say, look, the intergenerational solidarity point, I think, needs to take into account that the program was designed at a time when older folks tended to be worse off than people in their working lives. That is flipped now. The standard of living for retirees on average is higher than the standard of living for people in their working years, which again, to me, suggests that we should not be raising benefits in the middle and the high end, but rather restraining them.
Jared, so I'm not wealthy enough or prestigious enough to go to cocktail parties in Georgetown, but when I go to house parties in Columbia Heights or U Street, when I talk to my progressive friends, they're not talking about let's shore up the ACA exchanges or expand EITC or import German-style apprenticeships. They're talking big things: $15 minimum wage, Green New Deal, universal job guarantee. So which of these?
Some pretty cool friends, as you can tell.
So which of these do you find?
Can I go to those parties?
Which of those do you find the most, among others, most interesting and compelling, and which one do you find a bit kind of wacky and off base?
Of all the things, or those three, or
any of the hip new ideas right now?
Medicare for all is in the spirit of what I was talking about earlier. I like the idea of single-payer universal coverage, primarily because, not primarily, for a couple of reasons. One is that it's a program that is much, I think it's a program that works very well and helps constrain this excess cost growth that's been such a problem for our economy relative to all the other advanced economies. So the idea of more people getting on Medicare makes sense to me. However, the notion, I think one of the things that differentiates me from your friend at the parties, and part of it is that I'm just a ton older than they are, is that I'm kind of path dependent. I think you get from if you're trying to get from A to M, you got to go through all those letters between, whereas a lot of the folks I talked to at your party, I had a research assistant who we used to sort of spend all day arguing about this stuff every day. They want to go from A to M. They want to leapfrog all the other letters. And so if you talk to somebody about this and you say, well, what do we do with the private insurance industry and all those other people who have their hand in the healthcare delivery cookie jar, which is why we spend 18% of GDP on healthcare and they spend 10, 11, or 12%. So that's 6, 7, 8% of GDP, which is about 1.8 trillion a year now, is people's income and sectors with big lobbyists. I don't see how you get from here to there in leapfrog fashion. So I'm perfectly happy to have those folks at the party and anybody in here and everybody who wants to pushing for Medicare for all. I'm right with you. I'm going to march in the parade with you. Once we get into power, we may find that path dependency being what it is, we're going to have to think more about Medicare for more. Reduce the eligibility age from 65 heading up to 66, 67, reduce it down to 60. And maybe you can take it down to 55. So I'm more of a gradualist in that regard. In terms of subsidized employment, I think it's a good idea. I don't want to hog the stage here, so let me be very quick. I think subsidized employment is a good idea. I think the problem with some of the guaranteed job proposals is if you tell pretty much everybody who has a crappy low-wage job in this economy that you can have a government job that pays $15, $16, $17 an hour and has benefits, then the government now has to provide jobs for 40 million people. That's what we're talking about. And I'm a pro-government guy. These freaking people can't decide to keep the lights on for more than 2 weeks at a time. So that's a pretty heavy ask.
I'll try to assure my friends you're not an establishment shill.
Thanks.
Ramesh, so when conservatives hear these calls for free college or Medicare for all, there's a claim that the alternative is quote unquote market-based solutions. But it seems like conservatives struggle to get those ideas a hearing. Maybe it's a problem of communication or substance. Could you maybe talk through how you actually see why market discipline in higher education and healthcare could both control costs and assuage perhaps legitimate popular concerns about questions of equity, fairness, and opportunity?
So that is a lot to ask me, and I don't mind saying so. Let me just tackle higher education. So I think we've got a set of policies in higher education about which a few things could be said. One, they worked for a long time, trying to get more and more people, direct more people and more money into higher education. Made a lot of sense, seemed to be paying off, but I think has hit a point of diminishing returns. You'll notice that's kind of a theme of mine. Second, these are not particularly policies that conservatives, reflect particularly ideological conservative assumptions. If anything, is sort of more kind of an old bipartisan liberal set of assumptions. But conservatives tend to be a little paralyzed in talking about that. When I talk to folks on the Hill about coming up with a robust conservative higher education agenda, you basically get this. It's not people's comfort zone. They think, well, isn't that something liberals talk about a lot? And are we going to end up, sometimes you'll get, well, I don't see anything about higher education in the Constitution. Well, okay. If you are committed to actually abolishing everything the federal government already does in higher education, which is quite substantial and has done an enormous amount to shape the way higher education looks in this country, all right, go ahead, see what success you can have. But otherwise, let's talk about how we can improve these policies. I do think that that the system we have now is not working for most people. Something like 1/6 of young people is going from high school to enrollment in college to actually graduating from college to getting a career that requires a college degree. That is the ideal type of our current system. It is what this system is designed to produce, and from that standpoint, it is failing the vast majority of people. And I think that it is a multifaceted problem that requires tackling on a variety of fronts. And in all of these fronts, I think there are conservative principles of competition that can be brought to bear in terms of giving people more options. New financing options. So, for example, income share agreements, so that that people can finance their education in new ways. You can pass some laws that give those kinds of agreements new legal stability. New kinds of institutions. Break up what is essentially an oligopoly of accreditation, so you create different kinds of institutions. Redirect some federal money, which is which is extremely lopsidedly devoted to colleges and not devoted enough to apprenticeships and vocational education. Make colleges have some skin in the game, so that if you've got an institution that has a high default rate on student loans, it's not just taxpayers who eat that, but the institution that eats that if they're not graduating people who are equipped to succeed. So I don't think there's one silver bullet solution in that, but I think there are a lot of things that conservatives, often with support from liberals and Democrats, could achieve in that space.
Jared, we have a lot of Wharton School students here who I'm sure are anxiously thinking about how this trade war will affect their future investment flows and global supply chains. You've been somewhat of an outlier in D.C., including among Democrats, for your critique of the broad, quote-unquote, Washington consensus surrounding globalization. Do you think we simply need to, as, say, your friends at Brookings or the Peterson Institute would say, just do a better job of helping the losers from trade adjust through retraining or social insurance? Or do you think we need kind of a more systematic reconsideration of global economic governance? In other words, do you want kind of a kinder, gentler neoliberalism or some kind of global social democracy?
I think that the problem with the way most kind of elites think about trade is a couple of things. Stop clicking your pen. Thank you. Sorry, it's just a thing with me. So you have to. I think where Washington has gotten this wrong for decades at tremendous cost. I think you can connect the dots between your very good question. Even if you click your pen, you ask good questions. Your very good question and the ascendancy of a really dangerous protectionist, in my view, in the White House. And that comment should lead you to believe that I very much distance myself from protectionism, because I think global trade flows are a tremendously important advance in contemporary economics. And not just for us. It's great to have access to a bunch of cheap stuff. The increased supply of goods really does improve our living standards. But so that the Bangladeshis of the world can sell into global markets, and the Vietnamese. And so I think the more trade flows, the better. The problem is that the rules for trade have consistently been written by essentially the investor class on all sides of the border. So I've been very critical of trade deals and I read them, which most people don't do, I got to tell you. I read the NAFTA, I read the TPP. These things are thousands of pages, which ought to give you a clue. If you're talking about free trade, do you really need a chapter about how you're going to regulate, information technology and pharmaceuticals? And in fact, you will recall that Doctors Without Borders opposed the TPP because they recognized that it was going to extend patents on pharmaceuticals in ways that would hurt developing countries. The problem with trade is twofold, and you alluded to one of it. First of all, I know many of you have studied comparative advantage, and maybe if you've gone a little further, Stoppel-Samuelson kinds of trade theories, which I very much subscribe to. They're very clear that trade creates winners and losers. The problem in our economy, especially with the concentrated wealth and the pay-to-play politics, is not only do the winners fail to compensate the losers, they build walls around their community and pass tax cuts that very much make the losers even worse off. So yes, of course we have to compensate those who have hurt by trade. But we also have to have a very different group of people sitting down at the table making trade deals. And that should include labor, consumer groups, it should include physician groups. It shouldn't just be investors making handshakes. And that's the thing that gets under my skin. You know, the one person in the Trump administration who actually knows what he's doing is this guy named Bob Lighthizer, who is the trade representative. And if you actually look at the kinds of deals he's trying to create, some of what I'm talking about is in there. And Democrats are sort of struggling, saying, gee, we like some of what we're seeing. And if you actually listen to Sherrod Brown, who may be a candidate for president, I hope he is, I think he'd be a strong candidate. Sherrod Brown shares some of the kinds of arrangements that Bob Lighthizer is talking about. So it's possible that we're actually evolving in a better direction in terms of trade deals. We're still not doing nearly enough to help people who've been left behind by globalization.
So Ramesh, before we turn to audience Q&A, you've definitely been more sympathetic to other conservative intellectuals for really taking seriously populist critiques of the Republican establishment on issues like immigration, social insurance, and so on. But you do have no patience for the protectionist turn on the right. So why do you find those arguments from Tucker Carlson and company so unconvincing?
So I'm a convinced free trader, but I try not to be a dogmatic free trader. I can certainly see a case for a change in American policy that is designed to combat Chinese mercantilism, forced technology transfer, intellectual property theft, maybe more, this is a rear view mirror question of currency manipulation. I haven't seen that. I haven't seen an intelligent strategy from today's protectionists. Instead, I see things like, we'll take on China, but first we will alienate all of our possible allies in an effort to take on China by having steel and aluminum tariffs on every country in the world, practically. I see, and I think that that protectionism. Look, I disagree about Bob Lighthizer, for example. I think Lighthizer has been a career-long servant of the steel industry's interests. Perfectly nice industry, but there are more people who work in companies that use steel than in companies that make steel.
I agree with that.
And the steel protectionism that he has always championed ends up costing more jobs, including manufacturing jobs, than it creates. So I just think it's not that I've got some sort of religious devotion to free trade. I'm just looking at these proposals and looking at things that have been done, and I am not seeing anything that makes a lick of sense.
Yeah, I just want to make sure I register my agreement with the point about not just the steel tariffs, but all the tariffs. I am not against a targeted tariff if another country is dumping rubber tires grade 4, on our country. You should slap a tariff on them, and we used to do stuff like that. But the broad sweep that Trump is engaging in not only won't work, but it will actually exacerbate the trade deficit, which it's doing for reasons, somewhat technical reasons I can explain, having to do with the strength of the dollar. So I very much associate myself with those comments. And by the way, the thing you want to watch out for now is whether the Trump administration decides to take the tariff on Chinese exports to us from 10% to 25% on the $200 billion of Chinese imports into our country. Right now, the tariff is 10%, but it's supposed to go up to 25% on March 1st. And my view is
while we figure out what we want, right? We don't have a set of discrete demands for China.
We should cross our fingers and hope that doesn't happen.
All right, we have time for some questions from the audience. So if you have a question, raise your hand. Please say your name, your school, and then make your question a question. Shauna. Mics are coming around.
I'm Shoshana. I'm from Penn. I'm a junior. And my question is about free markets in healthcare. How compelling do you guys think Medicare Part C for all would be as a sort of compromise between conservative interest in free markets and a liberal interest in universal coverage?
I'm going to bop that one over to you. I always get my alphabet mixed up when it comes to this.
I think I got my alphabet straight here. So A is hospitalization. Where are you? Am I right about that? A is hospitalization. B is like physicians. Yeah. C is
Medicare Advantage.
Medicare Advantage, and D is prescription drugs.
Yeah.
Got
Right, yeah.
Okay. I could probably go maybe I could even take a test in one of your classes. So Medicare Advantage is a kind of a public-private sort of hybrid that people on Medicare often use to pick up stuff that Medicare doesn't cover. And by the way, it gets to a point that I think I was saying earlier that, I'm a big supporter of Medicare and Social Security, but these are actually not that comprehensive programs. If they were, you wouldn't need, A, B, C, and D. You would just need A. But you need, but the wraparound kinds of coverage is necessary. I don't really love the idea of saying we're going to simply make C a public option. I'd rather, because what I would like to see is an incremental path towards universal coverage. So for me, that's A, B, C, and D. Mostly A, B, and D, frankly, because the more people get into Medicare and the more we strengthen that program, the more younger people get into it who have a different set of needs, then I think the closer we get to mimicking the kinds of programs in other countries that spend 8% less of GDP. And just to be clear with the socialist thing flitting about in the air, none of what we're talking about is privatizing the healthcare system. That's the Canadian or the British thing. What we're talking about is a single payer coverage system.
Other questions? Way back.
My name is Madeline, and I'm a master's student here at Penn. One thing I think is interesting, both in reading your materials and hearing the lectures, that there seems to be a lot of policy consensus, maybe not a lot, but a fair amount on some of these issues. I'm wondering, how do you see breaking through the partisan gridlock that might be preventing us on a surface level from getting to issues that maybe we fundamentally agree on under the surface?
So I'm not. There are definitely some points on which we agree. For example, we may not be representative of our respective philosophical tendencies. Although, everything you said about Medicare, take the photo negative of that, and that's probably about where I am. I think that in both parties and both coalitions now, the whether or not everybody has articulated it to themselves, the working model is we have to win big, and then when we have supermajorities, we can get our way. That sort of the model for Democrats is 2009, 2010. And in a way, sort of, it's also the 1930s. It's also 1965, 1966 for Democrats. Republicans have never really had supermajorities on that basis, but the basic model is the same. You should get the trifecta and then ram through whatever you can. And I think that there are sort of deep structural reasons for that are going to be very hard to reverse. Right now, I'm looking at two political parties that are each held together not so much by shared philosophical conviction or policy objective as by antipathy to the other side. Antipathy to the other side's policies and objectives, and frankly, antipathy to the other side's coalitions. I'm looking at two parties that both basically at their core believe they already represent a majority of the American public and therefore don't need to compromise or persuade anybody else. And also believe that since they already represent a majority of the people, that if they ever suffer political defeat, it's illegitimate. None of this seems to me to be a recipe for compromise and bipartisanship, except on back burner issues that aren't of high political salience. So you can get some accomplishments on criminal justice reform because crime is not the top tier issue in American politics that it was in the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s. You can maybe, as I was discussing, maybe get something on occupational licensure because it's not an emotional hot button issue. And I think we can and should look for such places where we can make progress. But I think the big picture of polarization that is fed on itself and is continuing to feed on itself is just, it's really, really, really hard to fight against.
So I might be a little bit less pessimistic, although not much. First of all, I just wanted to make an aside comment. So I definitely am signing up for this occupational licensure. Is that how you say it? I think that's a fine thing. I'm all for it. I can't believe that would move many needles very far. So I'd love to hear more about, that seems very boutiquey to me, but sure, I'm fine with it. The only difference between perhaps Ramesh and myself on his answer is that I wonder if there maybe is an issue or two more where there could be some traction. So prescription drug pricing, it's such a, that would be a much bigger lift, but I know there's some bipartisan interest in that. Infrastructure, I think there's some bipartisan interest in that. I think the challenge with the latter, with the infrastructure, is there'll never be a bipartisan solution if Republicans hold fast on no new taxes. And that may just kill that. But if there are some Republicans who occasionally talk about, for example, raising the federal gas tax and using that for an infrastructure idea. The federal gas tax has been stuck at about 18 cents per gallon since 1993 in nominal terms. So that's kind of crazy if you think about it for a second. So maybe an issue or two more, but unfortunately, I mostly agree.
Other questions? Dicha.
Hi, my name's Adi Girdhar. I'm from Indiana University, and now that there's a lot more traction with like Medicare for all, and the Affordable Care Act has been mostly intact even after the Republican majority and control of Congress. I was wondering if we were to go to a universal single payer system, which country's model would best fit the U.S. and its interests? Is it either the NHS model, which is very socialist in the fact that all doctors are government employees, or is it something like Germany, where it's more towards individual nonprofits or things like that?
I'll be very quick. Germany, Switzerland maintain the private sector, but do a ton more on cost controls.
I mean, to me, this is like, what color unicorn should we have? Because, if you think about the last 25 years at least that I've been writing about politics, the central fact of the politics of healthcare has been the public's intense fear of Washington-imposed disruption on their existing health arrangements. The biggest problem that Obama had, first, when he was selling Obamacare, the biggest promise he made was, if you like your health care, you can keep it. And the biggest problem he ran into was when a few million people found out that was not true. So to have single payer, you're going to have to kick 180 million people out of health insurance arrangements with which they generally profess themselves to be quite satisfied. It just seems to me, so what Jared was saying earlier was, well, maybe they'll campaign on that, but when they actually legislate, it's going to, they're going to have to do something more incremental. That sounds to me like a plan where step one is lose the next election, and then step two is do something. It doesn't seem like it just seems like complete fantasy land to me, and a measure of the way that sort of the Trump era is deranging people in American politics.
Yeah. So I mean, I should be clear. None of the things that I'm talking about in terms of this aspirational opening of the window are going to happen in the next 2 years. And when we're talking about the kinds of advances that I like, that I'm much more optimistic than Ramesh that we'll get to, I'm talking about a really long runway, maybe a 10-year runway. And so I'm saying that I see us, if we are going to get from here to there, it's going to be the ways I espoused versus US, Canada or UK. But I take your points.
Nick.
Hi, I'm Nick, and I'm a sophomore at Bates College in Maine. I was just wondering, what do you guys make of the idea to potentially allow Americans to buy into Medicare and maybe even Medicaid, Americans who are otherwise ineligible? And do you think if a large enough chunk of the population buys into the system, it would be easier to usher in a single-payer model?
Yeah, so I think that those are much more realistic ideas because they don't directly threaten people's existing arrangements. I think you would have to there'd be questions about program design, whether you are unraveling or having adverse consequences on other people's arrangements. But there's something to be, you could negotiate about that kind of thing. I think that you could also talk about ways in which a big chunk of Medicaid spending could be cashed out and people could use it to buy out of Medicaid and get private insurance. And maybe you could have some kind of deal where you did a little bit of both of those things.
So I think that's the hoof of the unicorn, which, and in fact, there's a proposal, a real thoughtful proposal. Jacob Hacker, who's a Yale policy dude, has worked. I know it's Rosa DeLauro is one of Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro from Connecticut is one of the chief members on this. But I can't remember who the other one is. And I think it's called Medicare. Medicare for America, maybe. Vox had a really good piece on this. So whoever asked that question, you should look for this because it's pretty much in the spirit of what you said and what Ramesh answered. The idea is that you have some sort of a public option, Medicare or Medicaid. And I think that perhaps one theory of the case is that the private sector really has a hard time competing with that. And so eventually people move from their employer-provided plans into them. And in fact, employers can buy into it. So imagine you're an employer and I work at a place, they come to you, here's your health plan. What if they came to you and say, here's your health plan, one of the options is Medicare? Some people might avail themselves of that. So look for that plan, see what you think of it.
Ethan?
Hi, my name is Ethan. I'm a senior at Brown University. I just want to get back to the higher education piece Ramesh touched on earlier. Ramesh talked about kind of what Washington and even at the state level has been done to assist with higher education. Should we maybe be thinking about what public policy solutions there are to help those for whom maybe a four-year university degree is not the solution? So Rubio said during the election season, we need more welders, fewer philosophers. He was crucified for doing so. But do you think there is something to that?
I think there is something to that, but I don't particularly like that formulation as it smacks a little bit too much of central planning for my taste. But look, as I said earlier, I think that we have fixated on one particular path to a successful adulthood in our public policy and in our culture, that we have communicated the message to people that if you don't get a college degree, you're a loser, and you're a loser for life. That's not, it's the wrong message to send, and we've got to find a different way of approaching these issues.
Jared, any thoughts on that? Could you argue perhaps that the free college for all on the Democratic side is making the BA too central to a path to the middle class?
I don't know. I'm pretty skeptical of going there. I don't know as much about it as Ramesh does, so I shouldn't say much. I think that I do notice, I go to these kinds of discussions all the time, these debates, and it seems to me that the people who are arguing that not everybody should go to college usually have PhDs, and so that sort of makes me scratch my head. I guess the only thing that I'm pretty sure of is that if you were sitting in America in 1850 when we were sort of building our public education system, you might have convinced yourself that we need public education. Public education should support 12 years of publicly supported educational attainment. So if you're sitting here in 2019, that number 12 makes absolutely no more sense anymore. I think almost everyone would agree with that pretty handily. What should that number be? At least 14. And if you think of that as community college, we're almost actually sort of there. Because at least for people of limited means, community college tuition is pretty much zero. But I do think that moving from 12 to 14 in terms of understanding that as a baseline of public education makes a lot of sense.
We just come back at this. So we have pretty strong enrollment rates in both 4-year and 2-year colleges. What we don't have is particularly good graduation rates from either of those things. And the economic outcomes, your average salary for somebody who's got some college but not a degree, they're better than the person who only has the high school diploma and doesn't have and didn't get any college at all. However, they're closer to high school dropouts than they are to people who have college degrees. And so for a lot of people, you're ending up with debts, but not much of an economic advantage. Again, this suggests to me that you've got a problem. And I think part of the problem is that people on all sides of all higher education debates are people who have succeeded through the existing system. And it's in many cases, it's people who have gone to one of the top 50 most selective colleges in our country and have a vastly unrealistic picture of what higher education for most Americans actually is and looks like. I think that is a bias that tends toward the overconcentration that we've had in this particular style of schooling, and that's something that we have to combat and be aware of.
Before we close out, if the students here want to keep following your reflections and pontifications, where should they go?
Well, at Ramesh Ponnuru, there will be links to my articles and the occasional picture of my 5-month-old.
I'd like to see that. I write a column for the Washington Post for the Post Everything section. JaredBernsteinBlog.com is where I post a lot of stuff. And I actually have a pretty active Twitter account where I link to everything I've done. So at EconJared. So please follow.
Great. Jared, Ramesh, thank you for joining us. And thank you all for coming out tonight. For the Penn students who joined us who are not part of the Executive Council program, thanks for joining us. You are more than welcome to come in and come out to any of the panels that will take place tomorrow. So please drop by. Do keep in mind, though, that you will have to register if you're interested for the closing dinner tomorrow, and there's still spots available. For the rest of you, breakfast will open here at 8:15. The hotel is close by, so you really have no excuse for being late tomorrow. And we really will get started sharp at 8:45. So enjoy the evening, and thanks for making it here safe. Cheers.